Get on the train before it leaves the station. The truth train is coming, gonna run them down, run them down.
Alrighty, hello there folks, how you doing? Okay, we're back again today talking about Netflix's The Confession Killer. This episode 3 was quite interesting. It started to emerge what I suspected, but then a very, very interesting twist just at the end of the episode. But before I get into that, I want to make this very clear to people. These videos are not about how Henry Lee Lucas is an innocent man. That's not what this is about. I don't think he's an innocent man. I believe he did something to somebody at some point. But who knows? Because at the end of that episode, one person he's supposed to have killed turned up alive. If we'll see what comes of that in the next episode. But as far as from what I've gotten from watching the end of episode 3, it would appear that one of his victims is turning up alive, which would then create some problems. So yeah, that was interesting. But what I want to say is that this is not about trying to say that Henry Lucas is innocent or anything like that. I'm just saying he is not a serial killer. I'm just saying he didn't pull off all of these crimes. That's all I'm saying. I believe he probably did do something originally. Well, the girl who shows up alive at the end of the episode, her mother certainly ended up dead. But we're going to have to see what's going to come in the next few episodes, obviously. But as I thought, you know, it looks like essentially the Texas Rangers were just letting people come in with their case files, throw the case files down in front of Henry with some pictures, you know, showing and stuff that Henry could kind of look and whatever, and then he could put together a narrative for them that would work. You know, that's it. He would be able to give a confession that would kind of work for their case. You know, and we know that's unreliable. The idea is that the confession comes from the person, it comes from the accused, because then it gives validity to that confession because it came from them and it's corroborated by the facts. This method that they were doing where detectives were just coming in with their case files and spreading them out in front of Henry and letting Henry look through them for a while and then offer a confession. As I say, you know, I mean, this episode had so many things that was crazy. I mean, the way that they were so protective of him, you know, Jim Boutwell and the Texas Rangers keeping him at Georgetown and everything, like they were so protective of him. When the grand jury was indicted to look into whether he had committed the murders in Lubbock, there, or was it not Lubbock? What was it? Started with an M. Anyways, they were trying to determine whether he had done those, and the grand jury started to become a thing where a bunch of people were coming there, wondering whether or not Henry Lee Lucas had committed the crimes in their, you know, in their places of, you know, jurisdiction. It started to become this thing where a lot of Henry's confessions were getting called into question for obvious reasons, like things like he was getting parking citations far away from where a lot of the crimes happened and things like that were creating obvious problems. The thing that kills me here is there's at one point in the beginning of this episode 3 or back in episode 2 where we hear one of the Texas Rangers talking about when you first come into the Texas Rangers, they tell you, son, there's nothing you can do to add to the reputation of the Texas Rangers. So, you know, don't get too crazy or whatever. But then he goes, but we also say, just make sure you don't do anything to take away from the reputation of the Texas Rangers. Well, folks, I think that they're being, you know, they didn't follow that. They didn't follow that at all here. Because as soon as it started coming out that there were actual citations and things like that were being able to prove that Henry Lucas hadn't committed some of these, you would have thought the Texas Rangers and that task force that had been created for this purpose would have immediately jumped on those things and would have created a board where those things were all, you know, logged, so that they could rule out and rule out any false confessions on those days. They should have been working as the task force, right? Task force, right? They should have been taking an interest in this, and they should have been coordinating this, and they should have been laying this out and getting this, the logistics on where Henry was at all these various times when he was getting these various citations, when he was incarcerated and all that. They should have all been collected by them in the first place. What the hell is this task force doing? Anything other than creating a little Club Med for Henry Lee Lucas to roam around over there at the Georgetown jail? I mean, what are they doing? What are they actually doing? So yeah, that's where I'm kind of at with this episode. So then we move on. So there's all that coming out, obviously, where they're feeding him the confessions, which you guys know how I feel. That's an obvious problem. Then we move on to the fact that Vic Feazell, a district attorney there in Texas, he basically is the one that kind of was, part of getting the grand jury, together. And when that grand jury was convened, they were able to get Henry Lee Lucas from Georgetown, from the Texas Rangers, and they brought him into the town where they brought him into the city or whatever where this grand jury was convened. And so he was staying there during that time, during the grand jury. And the grand jury was going on. And during that time, Henry Lee Lucas, now that he wasn't under the constant supervision of the Texas Rangers and, sheriff's departments and that sort of thing, he was now starting to change his tune a little bit. He was starting to say that he hadn't done a lot of the crimes, and the Texas Rangers were starting to come under fire on whether or not they had just fed confessions to Henry and that sort of thing. So they were starting to come under fire, and it was starting to become a black eye for them. But instead of realizing where maybe they had some shortcomings and try to fix those, they immediately try to cover their butt. And in the attempt to cover their butt, they used the head of the Texas Rangers was also at one point he was like not the co-leader, but he was like the assistant leader of the FBI, or was like the vice leader of, whatever it was. He was like the second in command at the FBI before coming to the Texas Rangers and becoming the commander-in-chief there at the Texas Rangers. So he had connections in high government, places, being that he used to be second in command of the FBI. And so what he was able to do is he was able to pull some strings and had an IRS agent or agents coming and starting to look into all of the various lawyers there in Texas that had dealings with Vic Feazell, and started to threaten these lawyers that if they didn't say that Vic had accepted like bribes to solve a case favorably in their favor and stuff like that, that they were going to create tax problems for him and things like this. And it's like, holy crap, are you kidding me? Rather than going, okay, wait, we've gone a little bit overboard here with Henry Lee Lucas. Let's rein this in and make sure we do this right. That's not the thought here. The thought is, let's ruin another man's life, his marriage, his son's life, just so we don't have to face the music and the Texas Rangers don't have to get a black eye. Unbelievable. Unfreaking believable. My hat's off to Vic Feazell. Okay, he's one of the good ones. He's one of the good district attorneys, okay? It makes absolutely, I'm going to show you guys some clips here in a second. It makes absolutely zero sense to me what you're going to hear in these clips, because Vic Feazell obviously has, he prior to all this thing happening, he was an up and coming, DA. He was successful. He had a high conviction rate. He was doing all the things right that he was supposed to be doing. But when these Henry Lee Lucas things came, he was just like, no, they didn't pass the sniff test, and he didn't like it. And so he called attention to it. What you're going to see here in these clips is where these Texas Rangers are trying to paint him like he's some kind of malcontent, like he's just some kind of just weirdo who just suddenly turned on law enforcement inexplicably. That's like the way they're trying to portray it. It's bizarre. And the thing is when it's so obvious that they're the ones that are playing games here, ignoring obvious things like the fact that if Henry Lee Lucas was imprisoned in somewhere in, I don't know, let's just say New Jersey on a given day when a murder happened over in, say, I don't know, let's say Arizona, you can understand how that would be a problem, right? That he couldn't be in New Jersey and Arizona at the same time, right? So, obvious things like that, they obviously didn't care, didn't want. I mean, even when this stuff was getting pointed out, instead of taking it into account and making it part of their task force and making it part of the investigation, they chose to try to ruin another man's life. And they were going to try to put him in jail for 80 years. They were going to try to lock Vic Feazell away for 80 years because they didn't want to own up to what they were doing, and because they didn't want the Texas Rangers to get a black eye. Right? So, all right, I'm going to show you guys some clips here of these guys talking. It's just, I'm going to have some thoughts when I get back here. All right? Okay, here we go.
He's confessed to crimes he didn't commit.
Whoa. That statement kind of sealed my fate that they would never quit hounding me.
Vic Feazell didn't seem to be bothered about, in effect, coming out against law enforcement, which is not generally something that a district attorney usually does.
The DA had an axe to grind with the Rangers. And I believe that the sole purpose of that was to give the Rangers a black eye.
Feazell was stating they were looking into the unethical conduct of the task force, that we were intentionally feeding Lucas information. I think that puts him on the same level, in my view, than a lot of people I put in penitentiary for different crimes.
I had no choice but to go against that thin blue line. I had no choice but to violate the law enforcement brotherhood. It just wasn't right what was going on with Henry. I couldn't let it go.
Okay, so you guys get that? Let's run through that for a second. Here we have Vic Feazell, an up-and-coming DA, very high conviction rate, very effective in his job, and these two Texas Rangers are trying to say that he just suddenly had an axe to grind for no reason with the Texas Rangers? Like, just out of the blue, this stellar DA who has a stunning conviction record just suddenly decides that he doesn't like the Texas Rangers for no reason at all. We all realize how ridiculous that sounds, right? We all realize how ridiculous those two officers, those two Rangers sound saying that. Yeah, so, once again, I'm going to say this again. What they should have been doing was getting in with the task force and making sure the task force was doing its job and finding out where Henry was in his life prior to the, or during these killings when this whole thing was happening. They should have been making their business to find out where, the documented places where they knew Henry could be documented, and so therefore they could rule out whether he was participating in some of these murders. That should have been something the task force was doing, but it wasn't. So the criticism of the Texas Rangers here is completely well-founded. Completely well-founded. All right. Then it moves into the bit of, you see all of how they descended on Vic Feazell. He pulls into a court, I think it was into court one day, at the courthouse, and suddenly a car screeches up behind him. Federal agents are arresting him and all that stuff. And Channel 8 is there with 5 cameras to catch it all. To catch it all. Perp walk and everything. All of it. They perp walk him and everything. Vic. And Channel 8's there with 5 cameras to make sure they don't miss a beat. So that was one thing that stood out to Vic immediately. That he noticed that. He's like, oh, Channel 8's here with 5 cameras. On, something that should have been a surprise. So that tipped him off right there. When he eventually beat the case, and by the way, it is freaking hilarious to me how much Vic Feazell's lawyer sounds like Ron White. I swear, I want to hear him say, "So one night I was sitting naked in a beanbag eating Cheetos." But no, seriously though, Vic Feazell's lawyer, I swear, every time I heard him speak, I was like, I was waiting for a punchline because I thought he sounded like Ron White. But anyway, so they eventually get Vic Feazell off on those charges. Now he was facing 80 years, folks, 80 years of the charges that they were trying to bring against him for taking bribes and all that. And like I said, we know that the head of the Texas Rangers had pulled some strings, and he had gotten like IRS agents to come in and help bully some of these Texas lawyers into saying that they had paid bribes to Vic Feazell and all this stuff. Well, eventually none of it sticks. Vic is found to be not guilty, and it all ended up being pretty ridiculous. But dude, Vic almost got 80 years because the Texas Rangers didn't want to own up to their mistake and that they had been conducting the investigation improperly. Instead of figuring out how to change that and get the investigation on the right track, they chose to try to ruin a man's life. And like I said, it goes beyond that. It took its toll on his marriage to where it failed, and his son was having to deal with some of the fallout from this crap, because of what the Texas. So the sterling reputation of the Texas Rangers here is getting tarnished severely. Okay? Let me point out another thing. I don't know if you guys caught this, but in the very first episode, or maybe it was the second episode, when we first start meeting Vic Feazell, he talks about as a kid how he looked up to the Texas Rangers. He wanted to be a Texas Ranger, and he just thought they embodied, the class and everything in law enforcement and all that sort of stuff, and he aspired to do that. And he eventually did get into law enforcement after high school, but when he was in the academy and he was in all that stuff, basically they told him, hey, you know what, get your butt to college. And they made him, and he went to college and he eventually became a lawyer. But it was his admiration for the Texas Rangers that pushed him in the direction of law enforcement, making everything we just heard from those two Texas Rangers all the more ridiculous, doesn't it? If the Texas Rangers are what spurred Vic Feazell to get into criminal justice, doesn't it sound a little stupid that these two Rangers are trying to claim that Vic Feazell has a vendetta, an unfounded and unwarranted vendetta against the Rangers? An axe to grind, as they say? No. He just knew that what you were doing with Henry Lee Lucas was crap, and he wanted you guys to correct it. That's all he wanted. In fact, he even went to the head of the Texas Rangers at one point and was trying to say, hey, look, if you just tell me you'll look into this, I'll drop the whole entire thing and whatever, and we'll be done here. I just want to know that you guys are going to look into this because it's concerning. He was just concerned about it. And he was just calling attention to it that it wasn't being done properly, obviously, because more and more evidence was coming out. California was beginning to question the crimes that Henry Lee Lucas had committed, had confessed to there. It was as more and more of these people were starting to question these confessions from Henry Lee Lucas, the Texas Rangers should have been going, okay, wait a second, guys, we may have a little problem here. Maybe we do need to change our mode of operation here. Why was that thought not reached sooner? No, but as it is, more and more of these, places where he's, giving these confessions are starting to question them, and the Texas Rangers want to ruin a man's life instead of correcting what they had done wrong and where they were going wrong. So that's my criticism there, is that the Texas Rangers here could have done a number of things differently, and they could have course corrected at a number of points here when the evidence started coming out, obviously, that some of these confessions were bogus. They could have started looking into that, and like I said, they could have started making themselves aware of all the, they could have started looking into Henry Lee Lucas's past. They could have started pulling up all the parking tickets and incarcerations and everything. They're law enforcement officers. They have the ability to do that. They could have been doing that. What is this task force doing? I'm asking again, what is this task force actually doing? anything? Or, I mean, is the task force just a piece of paper that sits in an office where they just parade in a bunch of detectives to pin more, crimes on Henry Lee Lucas? Is that literally all it is? A confession factory? I mean, it doesn't seem like any real work, or at least any real detective work, is being done there. So this task force is laughable, in my opinion. So, all right. So then we get into the last bit of the episode, and it's where Vic Feazell is telling us about, essentially that his, the whole thing has basically made his life, it just totally altered his life. After that, he stepped down as DA before his term was even over. He was so disillusioned with everything after what had happened, after what was allowed to happen to him. He did win a $52 million settlement against Channel 8 and somebody else. And he won a $52 million settlement because they had slandered him. So he got it for libel. It was the largest settlement in U.S. history. He's actually in the Guinness Book of World Records. Because of what Channel 8 had done. I mean, Channel 8 obviously was in the know. They were obviously getting inside information to be there with 5 cameras the day that he was getting, pounced, basically, by the federal agents. I mean, somebody had to be letting that out. And they did that. They did that series of newscasts on him based on those, allegations that were given to the reporter. And we all know Nick Feazell ended up being found not guilty and all that. So all that stuff ended up being seen as liable. He got $52 million. But at the cost of his marriage. And he even talks about how his son has to endure some stuff. He has to endure some ridicule and stuff because of people out there still believe his dad is a crook and took all these bribes and everything. All this stuff that the Texas Rangers tarred and feathered him with. It's basically, by the end of episode 3, it's still hanging with Vic. It's still hanging there. It's affecting his son. It's terrible. All because the Texas Rangers, like I said, didn't want to straighten up and fly right. And to me, that's really antithetical of what they're about, because obviously the one thing that they're about is don't bring shame on the Texas Rangers. Well, that's exactly what they're doing here, is ignoring obvious things and setting the Texas Rangers up for a severe shaming. And that's what's happening. So at the end of this, Vic Feazell is saying, well, I found myself just looking, I didn't know what I could do. Texas Rangers obviously had him back at Georgetown, Henry Lee Lucas back at Georgetown, and he didn't know, and Vic didn't know what he was going to be able to do to try to reclaim his reputation or anything. He didn't know. He was looking for an opening, and then it arose. The opening he was looking for. And that was the fact that one of the victims that Henry Lee Lucas was supposed to have killed, the girl that was supposed to be his girlfriend, back at the first killing, and whose mother that they had said he had killed the mother too, which made sense. Like if he had killed, his girlfriend, and then the mother figured it out, and then he killed her to shut her up. So, but at the end of the episode, we see that 14-year-old girl, that girlfriend that was supposed to be dead and cut up and whatever, isn't. She's alive. She's on camera. She's talking to us and saying, "Look, I'm not cut up and spread across a field. I'm right here." And that's the way it ends. So, obviously, I'm intrigued to get into the next episode and find out more about what happened here and what happened to this girl, where was she, and that sort of stuff to get an idea of what's going on. But, yeah, obviously, it gets more interesting. But this is a huge black eye for the Texas Rangers, like I said, because they're ignoring the obvious here. And in doing so, in an attempt to cover their own butts, nearly ruined a man's life. I mean, nearly ruined a man's life completely, putting him in jail for 80 years for stuff he didn't do, rather than own up, rather than be the organization with the integrity that they claim to have. They chose not to be that way. It's unfortunate, because I've always thought that the Texas Rangers were a very upstanding outfit, that that they did it right, that they handled investigations properly, that they actually did things by the book. I always thought, and that they were honorable and all those. That's all stuff that I felt was the reputation of the Texas Rangers. And seeing this and what they're doing in this thing is just like, oh my God, they're just as susceptible to improper practice as any other law enforcement agency. So they're really not really that set apart. After seeing this and not only their unwillingness to see the truth, but then upon that truth being made really evident, their desire to cover it up and ruin other people's lives in an attempt to cover it up was very shocking. Very shocking. So, all right, that's about it for this one, folks. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe, and we'll see you.